Brought to you by the makers of Mush, it's new Stifle It! Utilizing the latest in nanobot and flavor technology, our new chewing gum will sense when you are about to launch into a one-sided monologue that no one asked for. Whether it's an exhilarating deep dive into the inner lives of cephalopods or your seductive mastery of ancient Greek philosophy, Stifle It will shut it down. Stifle It's salted caramel nanobot crystals will explode into action, immediately transforming ordinary chewing gum into a powerful hydraulic cement that prevents you from verbalizing anything beyond mumbled pleasantries. That means, thanks, Stifle It.
Welcome to the Tism. Here are your hosts, Carrie Thorne-Kenny and Joey Murphy, the Cagney and Lacey of autism.
You had an adventure.
Exciting.
You had an adventure. Nothing like making a life transition during COVID.
And dude, I moved us in like 3 days.
Okay.
I mean, I got it done, and I'm not.
I remember when that happened. You were energized.
But it was
You were energized by the challenge. I would have been in despair. Well, no, I would have been energized, but
it was also like this impossible game of Tetris. And, you know, Tetris is the only video game I ever played or got excited for. But it was like, have you ever had one of those, have you experienced this as an autistic person? There are all sorts of things that I don't do very well. And there's all sorts of ways that I'm like inconsistent. And then there's like a couple of things that I'm supernaturally good at. And occasionally, something I don't even know about or have never been good at before, I become weirdly supreme at for a day. Mm-hmm. Have you ever had that happen? Like, you know, I was a softball about 10 years ago. I got plugged into shortstop for a day. Never played shortstop in my life. As you know, Rudy Butler kept me securely in the outfield.
Oh my God, he'd so put me in the outfield. I was there. I was left to die out in the outfield.
Well, I mean, because the ball was coming from a long distance, right. I was freakishly good at catching things out there. It was the next part, where do I throw it? It was like, when I hit the ball, he had to remind me to run, and when I caught the ball, he had to remind me to throw. But the hitting and catching, very good at. Everything else was a crapshoot, right? Honestly. And so I was like 40-something. We didn't have enough people to play. I was playing softball. They put me in at shortstop. I don't even know what a shortstop does. Suddenly, out of nowhere, I am like the world's greatest shortstop. I shit you not. Like balls were coming at me. I was like, boom, boom, boom. I was like, I don't even know the rules for this position. What the fuck is happening? Like, did you ever surprise yourself like that?
I want to say yes as an autistic woman, because anytime anybody leads in with, as an autistic woman, has that ever happened right. to you? I'm going to go with yes, but I can't think of anything. But I can see that happening with you, because if you already like to throw
moons aligned
as the shortstop, you're like right there. It's prime position. It's actually where Rudy Butler put people that he thought knew how to play softball, because the outfield was
right field.
I was in right field, and I didn't know why I was playing softball. I didn't know the point. So I basically just stood there. I had a book under my arm, and I wanted to read. And sometimes I did read when I was in the right field.
Now, I remember being on teams with both Karen and Kelly.
Yeah.
Like, I know Kelly and I played for McDevitt together and for Rudy Butler. And I know Karen played, I know we were on Allen's Market together. I can't remember, were you on Allen's Market?
I was on Allen's Market, and I was on it with you and Karen. And Karen always batted like fourth. She was cleanup. And I was at the end of the bench. And she's younger than me. And let's just put it out there in case we do use this content that Rudy Butler was legally blind.
I know. This is my favorite story. It's one of my favorite stories. He is essential in my story because he taught me something about myself that I would not have learned otherwise. He of course attributed it to just me being really anxious and nervous.
Well, in case it wasn't followed, Rudy Butler was the softball coach in the community softball league. Okay, go ahead. And how old were you when you played?
And I would have been like 10 or 11 at that point.
Okay, go ahead.
And so he noticed what he interpreted as my likeliness to choke.
Yeah.
Which, probably there was some anxiety too, but it was also more like I was waiting for permission. I don't know if you know what I mean. If you ever feel like, well, what do I do next?
Right.
All the other units seem to know what to do, and I don't.
I consider it I don't know how to anticipate what I'm supposed to do next.
Anything, right? But what I learned from Rudy Butler is that if I do it 1 million times privately, it becomes second nature. He would keep me after practice, like down at Progress Elementary School. He would keep me after practice, and he and one of the other coaches, I think his name's Mr. Spicer.
I remember. He was Holly Spicer's dad.
Mr. Spicer would go field.
No, it wasn't. Jen Spicer.
Yeah, I don't remember the name.
Okay.
Rudy Butler, in the dark, would throw, and this is he was legally blind. He could still pitch and hit as if he was just using sonar, right? So he would pitch just 1,000 balls to me and correct my batting stance and get me, I just got the knack of when to swing. And he would do that. He did that all summer one year for me. And that's when I learned that if I could just do something repeatedly on my own terms, I could master it. And that actually came into play with really learning how to play the guitar later and any number of things. If I could just do this unobserved, I'll be all right. Go away.
I think Malcolm
but he spent
20,000 hours to become an expert.
Yeah, but I don't know if Gladwell's bringing in the unobserved and if I'm allowed to kind of just be in my own body with no one bothering me. Because I look back and I know a lot of my jerky motion problems were my instinct was to run one way, but then I also know that's not ladylike. So,
right.
And that gift that he gave me, that can't be understated.
He was an unusually good man. He really was.
He was.
I never saw him, and his backyard touched my backyard. And so I was around him all the time. His daughter, Heather, was my age. I was in and out of that house. He never was anything other than pleasant. He was just a really good person.
He was one of those men for our generation, one of those dad-aged men that seemed to actually enjoy children. I don't know what your experience was, but I'm men did not enjoy children. This was just interference in their orbit.
Well, he was on disability from Vietnam, so he wasn't working. So I think what he did was he gave to the community. Another thing that you might not have known about him was during 3 Mile Island when Harrisburg was evacuated. Do you know what he did?
No.
He stayed behind and he patrolled the neighborhood. He walked around the neighborhood with I really think it was a hammer or a sword, and and just kind of walked around, just kept an eye on things the way I guess you do if you're blind. And right. Well, he didn't have a gun. So
I know, well, because he's blind.
Anyways, my memory was that he walked around with a sword, and I know they had a samurai sword in their house, so it must have been that one. Anyways, I know this is because my dad also stayed behind. He didn't go. He thought that the best place that he could imagine was a community where all the women and children had been, forcibly removed by the governor. So, he had his 4 daughters, and he drove us to Allentown and dropped us off at his sister's house in their, small townhouse, and was like, "Here you go, bye-bye." And he drove back to Harrisburg and enjoyed himself. He had like a t-shirt that he bought from a bar called the Railroad House, and it said, "I survived TMI. I just got soused at the Railroad House." So,
nice.
So he told me that Mr. Butler was out in the neighborhood, kind of walking around, just keeping an eye on things.
Given everything I recall of that period, I am honestly surprised. I'm like 50% surprised that Mr. Butler did not, in fact, have a concealed carry license or something.
Well, he was also the quintessential Southern gentleman.
Yes.
Gentleman soldier.
Yes.
His older son,
Reb.
Yeah, Rudolph Earl Butler, the second or the third or whatever. Anyways, so yeah. Allen's Market. And Allen's Market was undefeated.
I know. We won the league
That's
that
right.
year.
Allen's Market was undefeated. I was not on that year when they were undefeated.
And that was the year the fruits of Rudy Butler's extra time paid off. I had the most RBIs of the league.
Yeah.
And I had gone from being a completely spastic.
Yeah. Well, and didn't you have Bridget Salinger on your team?
On Allen's Market?
The beautiful Bridget Salinger?
I can't remember. Yes.
Yeah, you did.
She was definitely on Coldway Refrigeration.
Yeah.
Because we did trade off in left field.
Weren't these were great names? You remember Post 1009 for the American Legion? Post 1009.
Well, wasn't there a bail bonds one too?
The best thing for me was we would go to Dairy Queen afterwards, and we could, I felt like the coach was this very rich person because he would buy everybody their ice cream. And that always blew me away, that one person would walk into Dairy Queen and buy ice cream for, 12 girls.
Ice cream for my players and water for my horses.
So when I played on Allen's Market, I just basically sat on the bench and waited to go home, and I went out in the field when I was prodded, and I resented my sister for batting fourth because I felt like I should be better than her because I was older than her. And and that was it. Like, I didn't really and I also know when I went up to bat, everybody walked in. Everybody. Like, I would walk up to the plate, and then the whole opposing team would just kind of walk all the way into the infield. I never ever batted with an outfield.
I'm so sorry. When you come next month, I have a 5-gallon bucket full of softballs and a bat, and we can remedy this.
That's fine. Yeah, no.
I still hear his voice in my head.
Okay.
Like, he's woven in. He's definitely one of my top 10 fixers. So, Dr. Zenia Boru was kind enough to come and speak to us here at the Tism, and I just wanted to introduce her and have her tell us a little bit about the work she does. Would you like to talk?
Sure. Nice to meet everyone. I'm Dr. Baru. So I've been in practice now for about past 4 years or so, and I run a small private practice focusing on developmental disorders, full spectrum psychiatry.
Mm-hmm. And you yourself, I believe, have been diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum. That was something you had mentioned to me.
I was diagnosed in my first year of residency. Actually, ironically enough, significantly after I had already decided to specialize in autism spectrum disorders.
That's kind of amazing. Do you think that there was any kind of, that seems like it would be a little bit beyond just kismet, that maybe you were drawn to interest in those sorts of things just from how you experienced the world? Any chance of that?
I mean, that's my theory on it as well. I think that I was always fascinated by the differences in the way that people perceived the world and interpreted the environment around them. And it's those differences that drew me within the confines of the research that I was doing to autism spectrum disorders. I think it's because I had always experienced there being this large disconnect in the way that I was perceiving the world versus the way that the majority of the other people were perceiving the world. And that's part of what fascinated me. And so that's what I ended up gravitating towards both academically and clinically.
That's really kind of amazing, because I know a lot of us did grow up with a sense that we were experiencing the world very differently, but not only was the discipline still very new and not common knowledge, most of us didn't go into that area of research like I'm an English major, so I would never have known. I just think that's really interesting. What was it that, was there something in particular that encouraged you to seek out an evaluation?
Well, I think all along, as I was learning more and more about autism spectrum disorders, there were just little tidbits here and there that I pondered and went, gosh, I have this thing, and that's frequently associated with autism spectrum disorders, but I can't be autistic because I actually have too much empathy. And at that time, that was still one of the prevailing theories, was that autism was primarily a social skills and an empathy deficit. And so because of that, I kind of wrote it off. And so it went something along the lines of, I'm in the neurology clinic and I'm realizing that I have ocular convergence issues and I have fine motor skill issues. And I'm realizing, hey, these are all things that are linked to spectrum disorders, but I can't be autistic. And then further on in residency, it's, oh gosh, I just realized I'm dyslexic. That's also linked to that, but I can't be autistic. And on, until later on, as I got more into residency, then I started reading more and more about some of the up and coming theories related to autism, which had much more to do with an overabundance of empathy and information flowing in, leading to people feeling overwhelmed. And as soon as I started reading that, it was kind of just like a light bulb went off, and I was like, oh, well, that actually makes a lot more sense. And oh shit, what if that means I'm actually autistic? And a couple of my colleagues also kind of brought that up as, hey, you have all these things that people on the spectrum have. Have you ever thought that maybe you're on the spectrum? And eventually I got a formal evaluation, and yeah, I am.
Kind of like the Hannah Gadsby. I think there's some information that you might find useful. I don't know if you've seen the Hannah Gadsby specials on Netflix, which I
have not.
Very funny and autistic. And she does a really nice bit about when you spot another feral autistic out in the wild. And it's like, okay, I think I don't know if you're ready to know this, but I just want to put this on your bookshelf. I have some information. I think you're going to need it. you know.
And we do very much tend to kind of gravitate together,
We really
as
do.
I'm sure you yourself have noticed and experienced.
Well, my journey to getting diagnosed began with dating a neuropsychologist who would like kind of do low key autism assessments on me. And then we'd go, wow, it's so funny. I have those traits, but I'm not autistic because I'm a girl and they don't have, like this was.
Oh, that sounds really familiar. I mean, it certainly would have, I think, provided a lot of answers in terms of the social struggles that I had had, but also just it would have been really, really nice to have discovered accommodations for the sensory issues that I have earlier and not have spent, decades of my life thinking that these were either moral failings or just really weird quirks that I couldn't seem to overcome no matter how hard I tried, to the point of where I was just burning myself out trying.
Amen to that. The princess.
So yeah, I mean, an earlier diagnosis would have very much been life-changing. At the same time, honestly, I think when I was younger, I was so deeply motivated to be normal that I probably would have been initially, at least, very upset by somebody suggesting that I was actually neurologically atypical, not just, had a couple quirks and needed to work harder to fit in.
Yeah. I know that I myself, you could maybe even say that coolness became a special interest in terms of trying to mask and just like, oh, if I wear this or do this, they'll think I'm one of them. So
yeah, very much the same for me. And that actually tends to be a really common special interest for a lot of females on the spectrum in general.
I still did it wrong, but the other girls didn't really care about my new socket set.
Shocking.
Right? I was like, but look, I have this now. Am I your friend? They'd be like, ew, no. When we last got together, you provided me with some really kind of like a radical piece of new knowledge that was there is a difference.
In terms of the clinical versus the formal diagnosis?
Yes. Or I think, is it me that used therapeutic diagnosis or was it you that used?
I use the term clinical diagnosis because that's what it is. A diagnosis that's made by a clinician like a psychiatrist or a psychologist that does not necessarily involve a series of highly standardized measures is called a clinical diagnosis.
Okay. If you're seeing a therapist and your therapist is like, absolutely, you're on the spectrum, and they put that in your notes and that goes into their system, what would you call that? Is that also a clinical diagnosis?
So that is a clinical diagnosis, although typically for the medical system, diagnoses made by therapists don't tend to hold as much weight as diagnoses made by psychiatrists, which don't hold as much weight as the gold standard formal diagnosis made by a neuropsychologist with the assistance of the gold standard assessments.
Okay.
And it's the same for both ADHD and autism. Again, there's the clinical diagnoses, and then there's the gold standard neuropsychiatric testing based formal diagnosis.
Okay. What are some of the things that differentiate? I mean, one obviously involves serious, slow, systematic testing, and one involves like an assessment of the person, right? Are these two professionals looking at different things? Like one is more interested
I wouldn't so much say they're looking at different things. I would say that they're looking at the same things through different lenses and to different degrees of detail.
Okay.
So for a clinical diagnosis, it starts with an interview. And it goes through kind of all of the broad array of symptoms that a person might experience during their lifetime. And for the majority of people, that includes some assessment of how they were as a child. So preschool, elementary school, middle school, those age ranges are actually crucial for making a diagnosis of autism, which is why making that diagnosis in adults tends to be more complicated. So that piece would be present both in a clinical interview as well as a formal interview. The formal interview would proceed through what's called the autism diagnostic interview. It is a highly standardized, highly detailed, step-by-step protocolized interview that goes through the entire range of potential autism-related symptoms a person can have in their lifetime.
Okay.
And that is scored to a specific metric then, based off of the responses that the person provides during that standardized interview. So it's a lot less kind of free form and free flowing than most clinical interviews would be.
Right. And it collects.
A lot of people, by the way, do something a little bit that's in between. So I myself, when I do diagnoses, I do something that's a little bit in between. That is, I will get a regular clinical interview, and then I supplement that with two standardized measures. One, which is the social communication questionnaire. That's a parent-reported symptomatology of how you were as a kid, how you are developmentally, and then a self-reported assessment. Mm-hmm. The RITVO is the name of that, looking at kind of your own perception of what your symptoms have been.
Okay.
So back to again, so that's the clinical interview, and then the more formal interview builds on that with a specific behavioral assessment where they have the person go through a number of different challenges that they perform. In other words, showing how they might describe a story from a book that just has pictures, showing how they might describe a simple action like brushing your teeth, things like that that allow the evaluator to assess how they coordinate their movements with eye contact, how they coordinate their movements and eye contact with their speech, whether they observe any stereotypical movements that the person engages in, how they modulate their tone of voice, things like that, that are all then quantified and put into a measurement rubric that then kind of outputs how far along you are on the spectrum of having almost no traits or having a lot of traits that go hand in hand with autism spectrum disorders. So that formal diagnosis takes the autism diagnostic interview, the social communication questionnaire, typically also for adults, the RITVO, and the ADOS interview, diagnostic assessment, and puts that all together in a lump to give all of that data that then somebody then interprets and makes the final call as whether you meet the clinical cutoff or not for an autism spectrum disorder.
What does RITVO stand for? Just to backtrack for a second.
So the RITVO stands for, oh gosh, let me look up the algorithm, the acronym for that one. That one I'm not remembering off the top of my head. Where did that one go? So what does the RITVO stands for? Oh, it's literally just the RITVO Autism Asperger Diagnostic Scale. That's why I was blanking on it for a second. It's the name of the person that originally invented the scale.
Oh, it's just somebody's name. Okay.
Yes.
No secret acronym.
No, so the acronym is RADS, and that stands for the RITVO Autism Asperger Diagnostic Scale.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I know from my own, I can immediately see problems with some of the, I didn't take the full testing, but I was given sections of different things. I had a couple different assessments by different people. But I could see how the more formal one could pose some challenges for women getting diagnosed, especially really bright women, because we know the answer you're looking for with what is the right answer for the social stuff. Is like, I know what I'm supposed to say. It's just that it's not really me.
Right. And women tend to be highly socialized to mask a lot more, and also kind of intrinsically trained in more social skills to begin with than males tend to be. So when you get to a test like the ADOS, which actually has a fairly low bar in terms of like how many things you need to demonstrate to score in the normal range, a lot of women tend to not score in the clinical range on one of those diagnostic interview assessments.
I know that as an adult, one of the things that was useful was I have much older siblings. And even though my parents were no longer with us, one of my older sisters had written an essay about me when I was a toddler. And I brought the essay in with me, and he was like, oh my God, this is like a 1973 dissertation on what toddlers with Asperger's look like. So, but I don't know that a lot of people can have that sort of recollection, or like I recollected being trained into being more vocally expressive with my tone of voice, or I used to curl my pinky fingers in, and I used to walk funny, and my mom trained me out of that. So those little...
Right. So a good clinician would put all of the different pieces together and not just go off of any one measure, but from the whole clinical picture.
Yeah. So fantastic. One of the other paths of thought I kind of went down after our last conversation is there's a lot of feeling in the communities of older women with late life diagnosis that I'm familiar with. We feel a little bit shortchanged because there aren't interventions and we haven't been studied. And so many of us desperately need what would basically be executive function training, right? And, people are a little bit angry that that's not available or that there's nothing for older people. And what I realized is that that's just by the very nature of we've made it this far, clothing and feeding and keeping ourselves in homes, and really that most interventions are for people who are much more vulnerable and in much more dire need. You're not verbal. You wouldn't be able to get yourself fed or clothed.
Right.
And I kind of want to talk a little bit about how we negotiate still needing things with not being an at-risk, relatively speaking, population. Like, what are some things, what do you do to balance everything? You have an incredibly demanding career, incredibly demanding education you went through. And it's not, we don't just have jobs, we have homes, we have lives, and there's a tremendous amount of juggling,
Right.
What are some things that you do to keep yourself together?
Well, so I want to backtrack and address the issue of whether or not there are supports available for the higher functioning individuals. And I don't think it's fair to say that there aren't supports available. They're not the same types of intensive supports that are available, say, for kids or for individuals that are lower functioning and have higher support needs.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, a highly functioning autistic person may have a really hard time getting onto, for instance, autism waiver services, which
Mm-hmm.
provide additional community supports and additional staff. They may have a really hard time demonstrating the need for that, but that doesn't mean that there aren't services that are available. Outpatient therapy is available, and there are a number of therapists, especially in Pittsburgh,
Mm-hmm.
that have a really good basis of expertise in addressing some of the difficulties that autistic people have, and especially in terms of teaching people the various workarounds for coping with executive functioning skills, the various workarounds for addressing some of the sensory issues, the emotion regulation issues that go hand in hand with the executive functioning issues, and so on and so forth. So there are those resources out there. I think people sometimes struggle to connect with some of those things, but they are there and available.
Two things.
So that's the first part.
Well, yes, and that when we spoke of that last time, that sent me down a pretty deep research hole. Two things I think of immediately. Very few of us would qualify for the waiver financially, because it's tied up with Medicaid. So many of us have been able to scrape by without that sort of help. And secondly, the big thing, and this is what I would ask you, what to plug into the Google. Interventions for executive function, workarounds for sensory issues, because I don't see those specific things listed on websites. Mm-hmm. We don't even necessarily.
Well, so a great place to start is that overlap with ADHD in terms of the executive mm-hmm. functioning issues. There's a number of really wonderful, for instance, YouTube channels that address ADHD symptoms and some of the workarounds. The one that I direct people to the most nowadays is How to ADHD. Okay. But there's also a number of books that have been written on that. But basically just Googling executive functioning difficulties treatment should get you to a wide array of resources. Mm-hmm. Then there's also, I have a whole bunch of links on my website in terms of autism-related resources, and there's a number of different agencies in the area that help connect you with resources. So there's Autism Connection, and then there is the kind of extension of the local chapter of the Autism Self-Advocacy Network, mm-hmm. the Pittsburgh Center for the Autistic Advocacy as well. And they're a wonderful resource, both in terms of connecting you with resources and for social outlets and social connections in the area.
Great.
But getting back to kind of how I manage some of these things, you have to build a life that fits you. And this is what I tell people as well, is you have to be honest with yourself about what your sensory and information processing and social recovery needs are. Mm-hmm. And then you have to do your best to try to build the routines of your life to accommodate those needs that you have. And so, yes, I do have a thriving career, but at the same time, I've limited it to a small private practice that's manageable for me and allows me to have the work-life balance that I need and the downtime that I need to not burn myself out.
And my guess is you've probably reached a place in life where you're also comfortable with making mistakes and recalibrating and knowing the mistake is.
Of course. And that's a really crucial part of the process in the first place, is that especially when there's major changes in your life, you have to take that step back, reassess and recalibrate, and sometimes rebuild some of the routines that were previously working well, but now have to change.
I would go so far as to say even investigate, not just replacing it, but why do you have this routine? Is this for someone else's benefit? Is this, my thing is that a lot of what autistics get in trouble for socially isn't necessarily empathy. It's that we are not programmed to volunteer emotional labor, right? Which is not the same thing as not having empathy. Like, we may not necessarily work for you at the time you demand it. But,
well, I mean, it depends on the person there, really. That's much more of an individual thing. Some people do that too much, actually, because that's their special interest and that's what they're really deeply engaged in, and have a whole other set of issues related to constantly trying to rescue people in their life, right? So, but it really goes back to, again, finding that balance of self-care with the demands of the rest of your life in whatever roles you happen to have in that life.
mm-hmm. My other instinct is that for the older women who've been diagnosed late in life, the most urgent thing might be just treatment for, just like CBT, for anxiety and depression. Mm-hmm. And those sorts of things are really where people suffer. And any competent therapist, whether they know autism or not, can do that work. Like, a lot of the really sabotage.
Yes and no.
Yes and
so with depression, definitely yes. With anxiety, it starts getting a little bit more tricky, because if a therapist is, for instance, misinterpreting sensory issues as being OCD, and trying to get the person to do a whole bunch of exposures to the sensory issues, you're going to run into problems very quickly, because you're not going to experience the appropriate response to those exposures, which is the downregulation of your anxiety response, because sensory issues don't respond to that. Right? So yes, there are a lot of more general issues a therapist who's not familiar with autism can address, but there are also a number of issues where they may not address it adequately, or they may provide advice that's actually counterproductive. And I've seen that fairly frequently in the work that I've done, and in terms of seeing the work that some other people have done.
Yes. My advice to people has been, find a new therapist, tell them you're autistic. Don't ask them if they think you are, because they won't necessarily have the training. Just tell them.
And sometimes people, because it is harder to find providers that have the expertise in spectrum disorders, actually have to be in a position where they have to educate their own provider a little bit about what this diagnosis means, and what this diagnosis means for some of the symptoms they might be trying to work on.
Do you have a specific resource that you would suggest to someone in that situation, something that they could pass on to a therapist, that the therapist would find a respectable source?
I mean, again, a lot of the things that I refer people to are on my website under autism-related resources. So, I mean, probably the article that I refer people to the most frequently is The Boy Whose Brain Could Unlock Autism. That article talks about one of the prevailing hypotheses about what autism actually is. That is, it's a sensory and information processing difference. And all of the symptoms that people happen to exhibit, they all stem from that difference in information processing, sensory processing. And I think that when clinical providers or even just lay people start to get a better understanding of that, their understanding of autism overall dramatically improves, and much more so from what I've seen than just being read a list of symptoms and being told that every autistic person is unique. That doesn't actually help people understand why autistic people behave in the way that they behave and struggle with some of the things that they struggle. And that understanding, I think, is so crucial.
Join us next week as Joey and Carrie induct each other into the Autism Hall of Fame. Our special guest will be Diane J. Wright from Autastic, and we'll introduce our special interest of the week and look for reader responses. Have a great week.
Underwritten by the Fuck 'em All School for Young Ladies.
You want to give your little princess the world, so enroll her now in the Fuck 'em All School for Young Ladies. We'll give your daughter the confidence of a mediocre American guy with our world-renowned programs in advanced swearing, loophole finding, auto repair, and only suckers pay retail. Our new capstone program, It's Not Me, It's You, is enrolling now. Check us out at www.fuckemall.com. Thanks again to Dr. Zenia Boru of Full Spectrum Psychiatry. You can find the resources that Dr. Boru mentioned at fspsychiatry.com. That's fspsychiatry.com.